If we were to talk about human trafficking, I guess the generic understanding is that people are forcefully taken away and forced to do something that they do not wish to. And that's a very basic, if you like, definition. However, there's some people who consciously go into some of these activities and then perhaps discover that it wasn't perhaps as glamorous or as good an idea as it might have seemed. And part of my motivation really is thinking through all the hardships that people have faced during COVID, the vulnerability that comes with that. You've got marginalized populations that are already susceptible to the conniving, if you like, game playing that you get from traffickers or seasoned traffickers. But I would imagine that in a period such as COVID, it really has exacerbated some of these trafficking concerns. So I might start with Juanita, if I may. Juanita, if you could just walk us through perhaps, for a person who thinks that this is everybody else's issue or something that they leave to Hollywood, you know, this is a Hollywood storyline. Could you just walk us through maybe some of the key vulnerabilities that might leave someone exposed to traffickers?
Most definitely. And I think it's a really important question, because the challenge that I see is that often the belief is that one of the main or the primary ways in which a person is exploited is because of poverty. Now, we know that poverty is one of the reasons a person can be exploited. They're offered a promise or offered a dream, and that is not the reality. They're taken often overseas or to another state or village. And what was originally a dream or a vision for a new life becomes a nightmare. Aside from poverty, though, people have to understand that an individual who could be from the LGBT community, somebody with a drug or alcohol addiction, a refugee, a person who's displaced. What about when we think about volcanoes, earthquakes, natural disasters? Your gender could make you vulnerable, even the area that you come from. We have to appreciate that vulnerability looks very different depending on the culture, the community. Because in a place such as India, for example, being a child makes you vulnerable to child marriage. Even being elderly, what about being disabled? In parts of India, we have individuals who have these physical disabilities that were not birth defects. In fact, they're man-made when an individual, a pimp or trafficker, will actually harm them. I want to use the term maim. They will disfigure the individual so that they can beg. We've even got individuals who will be on the street and they'll be begging with a child. What about if you are an orphan? That's a vulnerability too. But at the same time, I want to point out that we have individuals, for example, in the United States, who are not impoverished, who are not disabled, not from the LGBT community, but they're vulnerable because even though they come from a wealthy family, they're being abused sexually or physically, emotionally, and they run away from home. So being a runaway could make you vulnerable. Or let's say that you decide that you want to work in the sex industry, not prostitution per se, but in a strip club. Working in a strip club, you can become vulnerable to being sexually exploited and trafficked. And in fact, a lot of the women who end up in prostitution and sex trafficking are sometimes recruited, so to speak, in a strip club. So I want to really emphasize that we know that poverty is a big one, but there are so many other elements that we have to consider too, because in the US, the vast majority of trafficking victims are American. In the UK, the vast majority of victims are from the UK, et cetera, et cetera.